Hi, everyone. This is Krista Moore, and welcome to the Krista Moore Show. This is show number 109, and it's a very special show for me. We're going to be talking about a very heartfelt subject around a book that a friend of mine has recently released, and I'm excited to have her as my guest today. I want to introduce you to Katty Douraghy, and it's great to see you all the way from California, right?
Yeah, thank you, Krista. It's great to be with you here.
Well, first off, congratulations on your book, because I know it's not easy to produce. It takes a while. I know it was in your heart for a long time. I'm anxious to hear your story and learn a little bit more about what you learned as you went through the process of writing this book. And we're going to be talking about a tough subject today because it's heartfelt, and it's we're going to share, and it's going to be hopefully impactful for our audience today. Really, the theme for this show is hope and healing, and learning more about your journey from grief to hope today. So welcome.
Thank you.
So why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about who Katty is?
Absolutely. So I'll share who Cathy is as it pertains to the story specifically, but of course I'll share a little bit more as well. So who Cathy is, I always talk about. Cathy is a daughter. Cathy is a friend. Cathy is an entrepreneur. She's a businesswoman. But I think where the story really came in and where it resonated was my story as a daughter and as a family member. And how the story came to be was, it's a memoir, first of all, although I never intended for it to be a memoir. I never thought anybody would be interested in reading about my life. How it all kind of fell into place is that in 2011, within 4 months of each other, I lost my stepmother, my father, and my mother. Between January and April of 2011. So right now is the 10th, I call it an anniversary, is the 10th anniversary of their passing. And 2 years later, I lost two cousins and an uncle that I was very, very close to. And then 2 years after that, I lost my stepfather, which he was very near and dear to my heart. So for those 4 years, those hellish 4 years, for lack of a better description, I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about my own strengths, and I learned a lot about perseverance and just coming out of this dark side into my own, if you will. And I read this quote somewhere where it says, "Just when the caterpillar thought the world was over, it became a butterfly." And it really resonated with me. And that thing just stuck with me for a long time. And I was on a trip to Italy with a friend of on my own. Actually, I went away. I needed to just be away by myself. So I went on this trip on my own. And I met with somebody, a friend of my husband's, who lived in Rome at the time, Marcia Weeder. And she said, she's written several books. And I asked her, well, how do you go about writing a book? And she said, you know what? I come up with 10 words, and those words end up being the chapters to my book. And at that moment, I had never thought about writing a book. But as she said that, I thought, I have 10 words. I actually have more than 10 words. I think I can write a book, right?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I learned in your book, and I read it over the past couple of days in preparation for this interview, is that you have a very eclectic kind of background and growth. And then you moved on vacation to England or to London, and that ended up being a little bit longer than you had anticipated. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your upbringing and how that's impacted who you are today?
Of course, happy to. So I grew up in Iran, as you mentioned, and during 1978, 79, there was a lot of upheaval in my country with the subsequent departure of the Shah and the Islamic Revolution that took place. However, I grew up very sheltered. I call myself a very clueless person. I had no idea that what was happening was going to have long-lasting impact, and that it was important, important occurrence in our country. So when we left, we literally left with 2 suitcases, thinking, I thought in my young mind, hey, we're going to London. How cool. I get to miss school here and go on this vacation, not realizing that it actually wasn't a vacation, and that, it was the first step in immigration. We just really didn't know where we were immigrating to.
And then you eventually immigrated to the United States, and you've been here for how many years?
40 something years.
40 something.
Oh yeah. So
And
I've been here for 40 years. I think that makes me be a Californian.
That's right. Absolutely. I always talk about what you were doing when you were 10, and really looking back at who you were at that young, innocent age, and how that creates and makes you who you are today. And when I was reading your book, and you had stories in there specifically about those difficult times in transition as an adolescent, and then I'm reading your whole story, I could see the connections between your passion, your love, your desire for your mother, and then how that came out at the end of her life. And now that I say that, I'm going to take some time aside from this call to point you back and kind of connect the dots into what I saw in that reading. I'd like to hear more about your mother. Why don't you tell me about her?
Oh, she was brilliant. She'd never finished past, I think, I don't know what you would call it in those days, but she never finished past high school, would be what the equivalent would be. However, she had an incredibly sharp mind. She was a great businesswoman, great with real estate. She, whenever she could, she invested in properties. And actually, that's how we ended up in the U.S. is the one place that we still had property after all the upheaval that had gone on in Iran. And that's kind of why we immigrated here, is we actually had a place to live. But she was this petite 5'2" spitfire of a woman, just incredibly strong, but also incredibly loyal. She herself had lost her brother and her mother. And I talk a lot about this in the book because I did a lot of comparison between myself and her, and how she mourned and how I was mourning her after she died.
Yeah, there was a story in there. We'll share it, a little bit of a sneak preview. You were talking about how she was mourning, and for a year, the tradition in Iran is to wear all black and mourn in that way. And tell us what you did a couple of days after her passing.
Yeah, so first of all, I wear black all the time. You can't see it here because I wanted to make sure that it was bright for this call, but I wear black all the time. And during the first few days after she had passed, I just couldn't bring myself to wear black. I think I felt so dark and black inside that I really needed to project some color every time I saw myself in the mirror. And red was her favorite color on me, so I decided to wear a red shirt. And that entire day, I kept thinking to myself, like, am I doing the right thing? Should I be wearing this bright red color? Like, is she up there saying, like, what the heck are you doing, girl?
Yeah, right.
You're mourning. And I was. However, I just needed for it to manifest in my own way.
And it made you feel better. It made you feel better.
And actually,
I remember also an area in the book where you were talking about judgment, and that really feeds nicely into that, because when we're grieving, or someone that we are close to passes, how we act or respond, or okay, it's time to get over it, go back to work, you got 3 days bereavement, and is that okay? And so there's all this judgment around, are we doing the right things, are we acting the right way? Yeah. And share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so red was her favorite color on me. I think by wearing red, in my mind, and I only thought about this later, was in my mind, that was my way of connecting me with her. But when I was looking around, I was thinking, well, like, are people going to look at me and say, like, why is she wearing this happy color? Should she not be in mourning? So that concept of self-judgment as well as judgment of others both my judgment of others and what I was perceiving judgment from others, I think is very resonant. In people's minds, there's a timeline as to how long we should mourn.
Well,
Society dictates that too.
I
Right?
agree. And I think it's important to note that everybody grieves in their own way, privately, publicly, even culturally, societies. You're kind of raised to mourn a certain way, so to speak, or to grieve on a death. And one of the things that I enjoyed reading in your book was how you had a celebration of life for
Yes.
your mother, which really is kind of a new concept, right? And there could be a lot of judgment around, well, why aren't they having a funeral? Like, why isn't this the traditional method? And I wanted to share a little bit about something that I experienced along the way, because we talked a little earlier. My mother passed 2 years ago, and she was in my home, and we had in-home hospice in. And coincidentally, she had lung cancer that was metastasized, just like your mother. And one of the things that we wanted to do, she wanted, was a celebration of life at a time that was convenient for everybody to travel in to Pennsylvania to have this celebration. And we waited. She passed in May, and we waited till September. And there was so much judgment around, well, why did you wait so long? And why isn't it at a church or a funeral home? Why is it at your brother's house? And I just really had to pray on that and make sure that I was doing what I felt she wanted, what was in her, what her desires were. So I would let people know, well, this is what she wanted. This is what she wanted. And that helped me a little bit overcome some of that judgment.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where we can almost have to draw a fine line and say, you know what, people will think what they think, but I'm honoring the wishes of the person that we are honoring here. And if that's what she wanted, that's what
I was just thinking of another one. When my father passed, and he passed at a young age of emphysema, you talked a lot in your book about your mother and her smoking. And when I had asked you before about your mother, I have this beautiful picture. I'm going to have Eddie bring it up in a couple of slides of you and her when you were a child. Can you transition that? So I've got that. Thank you. I'll bring that up in a minute. But this picture of you and her tells such a story for me when I'm looking at that. And you talk about her clothes and her jewelry, and I'm looking at her cool purse and her shoes, and she was very stylish and very petite, as you described. And I'm thinking too that when you look back at these pictures, they're bringing some memories back for you. And I'm going to pop that picture up because I just love it.
I call that when I look like a boy. That's those years.
There's so much in that picture. Look at the way she's holding your hand.
Yeah, she was
I
lovely.
love that.
Yeah, she was very lovely.
Where were you?
This is in northern Iran by the Caspian Sea. And I feel very fortunate. I have a lot of my old pictures. And it's one of the few things that we did take with us when we left was these old photographs. So I feel very fortunate that I'm surrounded by these pictures.
Yeah. And, you were talking about her in a way in the book, then there was so much love coming through that I was kind of tearing up thinking about my own relationship with my own mother. And one of the things that you talked a lot about is, telling her throughout the years, stop smoking, quit smoking. And that, you referred to the cigarettes being more of a friend for her than anything. And tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's something that I didn't realize at the time. And I think if there's a regret, and not if there's a regret, there is a regret. And that is not realizing at the time where she was coming from, especially during the final years of her life and her not giving up her smoking. It was just such a trigger for me. But later I realized that it was her holding on to the one and only thing that had been constant in her life for 50 years.
Yeah.
And it was the one and only thing that gave her some respite from everything she was going through.
Yeah. And I was starting to tell you about my father dying of emphysema, and he smoked, 2 packs of Lucky Strikes a day. And you would see him with a cigarette while he's eating, like the ashtray would be on the table with the food, and this was just a way of life. I remember wanting him to quit many, many, many times, especially with his emphysema. And he was on a respirator for 180 days. And then when they went to take him off, he was supposed to have passed, but he didn't. He lived actually a year longer. And in that year, I thought, there's no way, he's going to smoke. He's carrying around oxygen with the cigarette. And I think he might have quit for maybe a month. And when he would come over to my house to visit, which he came every day because I set him up a workshop in the garage. So I'm upstairs in my home office starting my new company, and I could hear the garage door open, and he'd come and he'd do his woodwork and things like that. But he would always kiss me goodbye. But then he stopped kissing me goodbye. And then I realized he had been smoking and he didn't want me to smell it. But he was going to have his cigarettes, whether, I was going to tell him he shouldn't have them. It's almost like like I said, my mother, she smoked too. And she quit after my father passed away, we thought. But I know that she didn't. I'd get gifts in the mail and open them up, and I could smell the tissue paper. I know she's smoking. No, I think she did finally quit. But, it is hard. And there is a little bit of regret that maybe we could have let that go a little bit easier than hounding them so much about it. And then you talk in your book how you smoked. I loved to smoke. I mean, I started on my 16th birthday because it was the cool thing to do. Yeah. You were smoking when you were 13.
Yeah. It was, in Iran especially, it was such like a normal thing to do, and it was around me everywhere.
Yeah.
So I never thought anything of it until in my adult life, and I realized. Right. Yeah, it's and I think that goes back to judgment as well. Mm-hmm. I did judge, and I think that lung cancer as a disease, unfortunately, has a stigma around it. I think it's the very first thing.
I agree.
When I say to people how my mother passed away, the first question they ask is, "Oh, was she a smoker?" Well, yes, she was.
But also, you mentioned in your book how so many of your family members had lung cancer and did not smoke. That it very well could have been something in where they grew up, or some kind of chemical. I mean, we grew up in a coal mining town, and my father had emphysema. It might have been a little bit of that, but I also know he smoked a lot. Yeah. But regardless, that judgment's there. You had mentioned about how people might perceive someone passing and thinking, well, they could have stopped that. Maybe they could have prevented that because it was their own choice to smoke cigarettes, let's say. And I think it's tough. It's difficult because that is a personal choice, but we can't judge them, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a big lesson learned there is, to just be and just to be empathetic and just to be and not have all of these other things permeate that. That's probably the purest way of just loving and just being with someone.
Yes.
And it just took me a little while to get there.
I'm right there with you. One of the things that I really enjoyed about your book was how open you were to this grieving process and realizing that maybe you didn't grieve perhaps fully, or that there still is some mourning that takes place. Mm-hmm. And writing your book was your way of honoring your mother and giving a beautiful gift back to the world so that others can be impacted by your experience and be able to look at grieving and mourning in a different way. What is your goal there?
My goal when I first wrote the book was really just that, is I wanted to make sure that that I just got out the things that I just didn't have time to finish saying. So it
Mhm.
was more of a cathartic exercise for myself. And it's something that I highly recommend to everyone who's going through it is, there's an opportunity to still finish those unfinished conversations, to write, to really encourage people to write.
Yeah, you shared the story of being in an EO event, I think, or maybe you were somewhere with Jamie and Winnie came up to you.
Mhm.
Why don't you tell that?
Yeah, so when I first met a mutual friend of ours, Winnie Hart, uh, this was in 2011. This was maybe a month after my mom had passed, and I had
Mhm.
accompanied Jamie to a conference. And for those of you who know Winnie, she's larger than life in her spirit and her energy. So she comes out of nowhere and just gives me this big hug, and I didn't know who she was. And she said, "Hey, I heard your mother's passed recently. My mother has also passed. Why don't you go upstairs and just go write to her? Go write." And I'm like, okay. And that was really the first start in realizing that, oh my gosh, I had so much unfinished things to say. And that really was the genesis of kind of just getting into this thought pattern and getting into writing and continuing this
Yeah.
dialogue. And
Yeah,
that
it's
helped
so
heal me.
important. And one of the things that you talk about too in this writing, it's really getting this message out, but it's sharing your memories. As
Mhm.
you were writing it, I could just only imagine the feelings of going back and kind of opening up these stories and the characters and remembering specific instances that you're able to put into a beautiful manuscript.
Thank
Um, that, that's it's vulnerable
you.
to publish it. I think I don't know if I told you earlier when we were talking about grief, and in your case you had lost multiple loved ones in a short amount of time, and maybe you didn't have time, to grieve from one to the other because there was so much going on. I wanted to share an experience that I had in 2004. A daughter of a good friend of mine was in a tragic car accident at the age of 15, and she was a friend of my daughter's too. And so this really affected our whole community. It was devastating. Within a couple of months, my father passed away in at the beginning of February, and then his mother, my grandmother, who is my rock, she's like, I was so close to her growing up, and she means the world to me. She passed away 3 weeks later. And they say that she passed away from a broken heart. He was her oldest son. And to see a child go, before, in both cases, before the parents, it was just really, really, really difficult. And I remember not grieving so much for my dad
Yeah.
because he'd been dying for years. And I'm saying that kind of facetiously. But this was the guy that survived like 9 lives and on the respirator for 180 days. I actually wrote his eulogy probably 4 times.
Mhm.
So it wasn't a shock, but the shock of a child's accident
Mhm. Oh yeah.
or the shock of what, dad just died and now grandma's dead, that changes the grief process for me. That, they talk about the grief process at the beginning. Number one is acceptance.
Mhm.
I can accept it if I know it's going to happen and I can kind of prepare for it. But to just bam, for it to be a tragedy out of nowhere, that acceptance portion of grief, I think, takes a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. And I think that um, so much of grieving and mourning, the personal internal grief and the external way that we talk about mourning and the rituals that we have, so much of that is so personal, and to each
Mhm.
of us is going to be very, very different. um, but I also still believe that a lot of that conversation's in the shadows. People don't talk about it, and my hope is that we can have this opportunity to have honest conversations about what it is that we've gone through, how we feel, how we felt, what that journey was and is for each of us,
Mhm.
and just create this space. So I thank you for being able to have.
I love that because we're talking about it, and
Yeah.
we're talking about it today.
Yeah.
I love writing about it. When my grandmother passed, I was getting ready to go to California for a speaking engagement, and I had just started my company a couple of years before, and I just started speaking internationally. And she'd be so proud because she was the one that said, "Why don't you put your name on a business card and go sell yourself?" You know, I mean, she wanted me out there alone. So when she passed this one morning and I got the phone call, I was supposed to get on a plane and I had to make a decision. Am I going to get on this plane or can I even do this? And I honored her. And I thought, Grandma would want me to get on the plane and go to this speaking engagement. It was in California. And I had some wonderful moments there where I felt that she was present. So it was a beautiful, a lot of stories behind that. And when I got on the plane, I sat in the corner and I got my journal out and I'm boo-hooing and I'm writing. And I wrote the whole way from, I don't know how many hours that is, from Raleigh to California. And no one sat by me. And I remember hearing the stewardess one time say, "Oh, she's grieving." Like, don't, give her space. But I was a mess. And you talked about crying in the corner and in the bathroom and on the floor and just the almost the screaming, crying, uncontrollable. I experienced that with her passing. And I probably judgmental. I'm probably thinking, people probably thought I was, crazy. And I couldn't speak at her eulogy, but I, gave this wonderful speech 3 weeks before at my dad's. So I'm just sharing that story more so that you know that you're not alone.
Thank you. No,
But
so
yeah, but also the therapy of writing and speaking. I also wrote, actually, my book, Race to Amazing. This one here. It's dedicated to my dad and my grandmother.
Beautiful.
And there are stories throughout. So I'd like to leave the audience with a little bit of the hope aspect of the journey of grief to hope, because one way that both of us have determined to honor those that have passed and to kind of live through our grief is to write and to go ahead and to continue sharing the story and talking about them. When I talk about my dad and my grandmother, which is in the book, and when I'm on stage and I'm trying to connect stories of their life and sales or sales leadership, it makes me feel good. And it helps me deal with that grief. And it's a way to mourn.
Yeah.
I want you to share with everyone what your plans are for the next step in giving others hope and using writing. Aren't you doing some journal creation or tell me?
Yeah. Thank you for asking about that. So as I was going through this process and just the lessons learned and how I incorporated self-care in my daily routine, how I incorporated gratitudes and how I incorporated having intentions on a daily basis. The little things that I didn't really think were things that I was doing, but I had actually absorbed and learned from others, especially because of EO, Entrepreneurs Organization. What I decided to do is to create a grief journal. So I'm in the process now. Actually, it's with the designer currently. I'm hoping that it's going to come out hopefully in the next couple of months, but really with the goal that anyone who's going through this process, if they need prompts to get the writing going, if they can't do it on their own, to provide some sort of a tool for them so that they can. And it's called Hope in Grief.
That's beautiful. I love it. And you're taking it to a whole nother level. I mean, your intention is to impact over 1 million people with your book, with this message. And that journal is just another way to help the masses who are going to be dealing with this at some time in their life.
Yeah, and you know what? It's obviously I wrote this book. It took me 3 years to write it because it's just such a difficult topic to have to keep revisiting. And I wanted it to come out because this is the 10th anniversary of their passing. It just so happened to coincide with what our world is going through right now.
Yeah.
With 500,000 deaths. It's just, I can't even fathom what people are going through. now where their grief is so raw. But if just to leave everyone with, just write, just continue that conversation on your own.
Yeah, you don't have to mail the letter.
No, that relationship will continue going on.
Yeah. But you know what comes from that often is forgiveness too.
Mhm.
And that sometimes is part of the mourning process.
Oh yeah, big time.
Definitely. Well, I want to share some contact information as we close this call. And in the meantime, I do want you to, is there anything else you want to say or share today?
I think I'd like to leave everyone with the fact that it may feel as if we're alone on the journey, and on this journey from grief to hope, and on this journey of healing. But it's important to know that we're not alone on the path, that there are others. And the more we can speak and connect with others who are going through the same thing, we can each just help one another through this process. So to reach out, there's grief communities out there. There's plenty of online resources for it. There's plenty of podcasts about it. Just immerse yourself within this community, because there are resources out there, and there is hope.
Well, and this is 10 years later for you in the loss of your mother. And that doesn't mean that you need to be over it and get on and move on like our society tries to almost encourage or push us. So I'm thrilled that you're bringing this topic up, because we need to talk about it. I felt like it was therapy today.
I'm glad. And I'm so sorry that you went through all that you've gone through, but unfortunately we all will at some point.
And I really think it's how we come out in the end.
Yeah.
And I love sharing the stories, because that helps me remember. So here's a slide that has your contact information and also the cover of The Butterfly Years. And it's available on Amazon, but I also think you've got it on Kindle. Is that right?
I do. And then I have a special going on Kindle until the end of this month for just 99 cents. So
that's great.
Provide some respite for people.
That's great. So I hope you'll pick it up, and I've got my version right here.
Yay, thank you.
And I highlighted it. So it's something that I'm certainly going to be referring back to. And I want to just leave everybody with this one quote that was in there. Hope and fear cannot occupy the same space. Invite one to stay. I love that.
Yes, one of my favorite Maya Angelou quotes.
Angelou, absolutely. I'm going to read something else you wrote, because I just love this. I was grieving and yet living life to the fullest. That's possible. That's possible. And that's part of the hope that I saw. Great.
Thank you, Krista.
Thank you so much. It was good talking with you. Take care.
Show. Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.